Great. Okay, so as I said, you're all very welcome to this session on tackling disinformation and building media literacy. Just a reminder that this is a Zoom webinar, so you won't be able to unmute yourself or speak. Please do use the chat function to say hello and to introduce yourself, say where you're tuning in from today, and then any questions that you might have for our panel of speakers today, please use the Q&A function. You'll see all of that at the bottom of your screen. The chat is just for general chat among the participants, and the Q&A is for any questions that you might have for our panelists. So just to quickly go over what we'll cover today, as I said before, I'm just going to do a very short welcome on behalf of the Wheel and also the European Parliament Liaison Office, who we are collaborating with on this event. Then we'll be handing over to Chris Crokely of the European Parliament, who will talk about the Parliament's perspective on tackling disinformation, just for a few minutes. Then we'll hand over to Eileen from Media Literacy Ireland, who will talk about media literacy skills training. So she'll do about a 40-minute input on that. So that's kind of the training segment of today's session. And then also we will hand over to Sarah from Task to talk about their project, Media Literacy for Democracy. So as an example of a media literacy project that was led by a sector organisation for anybody who might be interested in doing their own projects. So at the end of all of that, of those kind of inputs from each of our speakers, we'll have a bit of room for some Q&A. So as I said, use the Q&A function below and ask your questions, and we can pose them to our panelists, and then we'll wrap up and we'll aim to be out of here by 4:30. That's the goal. Just other kind of quick notes before I hand over to Chris. Everybody will receive the recording, they will receive the slides. So, you know, there's no need to try and scribble or write down everything and remember everything. You'll receive all of the follow-up. And you can always kind of reach out to us then as well if you have any additional questions. But I think that's it for now. I can hand over to Chris. So over to you, Chris. You're ready.
Thanks a lot, Emma, and thanks everyone for joining. And thanks for your interest in media literacy. My name's Chris Coakley. I work for the Spokespersons Unit of the European Parliament. I will share my screen and presentation and hope it still wants to work. Here we go. So hopefully you can see that now. Emma, if you could just give...
Yep, perfect. Yes. Could see it perfectly. Perfect. Thank you, Chris.
Glad it's working. Okay, so I'll talk to you a bit about what the European Parliament is doing in this area and what we've been doing the last few years. I know you're going to have a more in-depth training part of this later, so I won't go into too much detail, but just to give you a bit of background, what we're working on. And I will ask you a couple of questions where you can respond in the chat. It's more of a kind of informal little quiz or test or something like that. So you could use the chat function for that rather than the Q&A. So first things first, you know, what are we really talking about here? When we talk about media literacy, we talk about disinformation. What we're really talking about isn't just some kind of online problem, even if it's very often talked about in those terms. It's about democracy itself. And what we see in these images are violent protests that took place in Washington, D.C. and in Brasilia, based on kind of false information, unproven allegations of election fraud. And it's really just to remind ourselves of the message of what's really at stake. It's about democracy itself. It's about trust in institutions. And if you've seen any of the information campaign we've done around the European elections coming up next month, don't forget to go and vote. We've really focused this time on democracy itself. 5 years ago, we were talking about various bits of legislation Parliament had passed and how they might be interesting in your daily lives. You know, now, given the situation around the world and in Europe, we're talking about democracy itself. Here's a little question for you. A couple of years ago, we surveyed people across all EU 27 countries, and we asked them how often they felt they'd been exposed to disinformation over the previous 7 days. So what you can see there is all these bars. On the left are the ones who felt they'd been most exposed, the countries where people had felt, you know, it had happened a lot, and towards the right, the ones where it's the least. I'm curious where you think Ireland might be on that. So if you want to put in the chat function, just briefly, you could say above or below, meaning above the EU average or below the EU average. I'm curious what you see that. Or perhaps your own experience. So I won't do too much suspense because I've not got a lot of time to talk. So let's have a look. And the answer is a little bit above, or fairly above the average. So in Ireland, 14% said it was very often. What I would emphasize rather than just that is if you look across all EU countries, more than half felt they've been exposed to disinformation. And so it's recognized as a serious problem. The next one is how confident you feel when you recognize, how confident are you that you can recognize disinformation? And again, perhaps you could just put in the chat above or below if you think in Ireland people are more confident than the EU average or less confident. Feel free to have a guess if you're not sure. And this is, of course, kind of self-assessed. So it's not really a scientific way of testing how able people are. It's just their confidence. And let's have a look at the results, different views. And in fact, you might be surprised to see that Ireland is first, the most confident. Is this to say that we actually can just end this meeting now and everyone feels very media literate? Unfortunately not. Of course, confidence is one thing. The reality is something else. And we know that the problem persists everywhere. Another quick kind of thought for you before we talk further, it's useful to talk about the terms that we use when we're discussing this topic. Fake news was word of the year in the dictionary a few years ago. It's become such a politicized term that it can mean different things to different people. Anything you don't like, you can just call it fake news. So when it comes to the policy making and let's say the training and other things we do in this area, we talk about the terms misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And the difference between these, misinformation is false but without intention to mislead. So maybe someone who thinks that someone gives you some false information but with good meaning, with good intentions. Disinformation, we're really talking about deliberate intention to mislead, and this is where we have, of course, a lot of difficulties. We're talking about content that is legal but harmful, and other kinds of harmful content include sort of leaks, hack and leak operations, harassment, and that kind of thing. So it's important to understand that when we're talking about disinformation, of course, it's not a new thing. Disinformation has always existed, but as a policy challenge for legislators in the European Parliament, it's really the last 10 years or so that we talk about action, and that begins in 2015. The External Action Service part of the European Union launched a Stratcom. This was to counter Russian disinformation that was spreading in countries neighboring the EU after they annexed Crimea. And this spread, obviously, there was a lot of reports of interference in elections, both in the US, in the UK Brexit vote, and elsewhere. So before the European elections in 2019, the European Commission launched a few initiatives. One was a code of practice for platforms. So the big platforms like Facebook and many others, YouTube and so on, signed up to a code of practice to voluntarily work together to fight disinformation and to report on the actions they were taking. This was completely voluntary. So what you see after elections is rather legislation coming. And to be clear, it's not that legislation is really the answer to disinformation. I think the focus on media literacy today is a really good one, because clearly disinformation legislation can only go so far. You want to take action without infringing on the fundamental rights of freedom of expression. So the legislation that's enforced now concerns digital services. It's where platforms have to be more transparent and more accountable. But to be clear, this doesn't involve some kind of efforts to suppress discussion online. It's really about avoiding the unnatural, the sort of inauthentic augmentation or amplification of some false information that's done sometimes in a very targeted way and sometimes by foreign countries. So talking about what the Parliament's doing, so that on the staff side, we work quite a bit on situational awareness, so monitoring and analyzing the things that we see, and also media literacy activities, I'll give a couple of examples of things we do. When we analyze, and I won't go into detail on this, but when we analyze, we look at a lot of different things. And there's often a false impression that big institutions, when they're looking for disinformation, they're trying to act as fact checkers, trying to sort of look at things in terms of true or false, true things that people are saying about us or false things. And in reality, it's much more nuanced. We're much more interested in the behavior side of things. Are there networks working together in an inauthentic way to spread false information? It's not so much about the information itself. And as you know, there's a very broad range of opinions in the parliament. So it's not about entering the political debate. It's about understanding where manipulation is taking place and who might be behind it. So this is what our analysis might look like, these things mushrooming. There's a difference between, excuse me, like an authentic debate and an inauthentic one. So an inauthentic one, you would be able to see where, for example, one message has been pushed out by multiple accounts very quickly. And that shows that something is being done in an inauthentic way. A little challenge for you again. Which face is real? So talk about artificial intelligence briefly. One of these photos is AI generated, and the other one is a photo of a real person. And I'm curious to see which one you think is real. So if you could indulge me by going to the comments again and saying left or right, or whatever you like. I'm curious to see. And the point of this, of course, is that it's very hard to tell. And if you saw these photos out of context, if it wasn't in a quiz, both look pretty genuine. So I don't know if there's a preference. So I can tell you that the boy is the real one and the lady has been created by AI. There are a couple of telltale signs. Teeth is often a more difficult thing for AI to generate. Ears as well. It's a little fold on the neck. But generally speaking, of course, AI has become very good at creating false images, and these can be applied in disinformation contexts. We've seen cases, for example, of journalists that don't exist. Very easy to create a fake profile, not just for fun, but for a kind of harmful intent. A journalist who doesn't exist, very easy to use a logo from elsewhere and create a media outlet that doesn't exist and take it on that way. But to emphasize, in terms of what we see really affecting the European Parliament, more often it's not, at least so far, these AI generated images. It's more factual information that's just taken out of context. And we have some resources that might be interesting for you to dig into more detail later. So we have something called the Media Literacy Compass. It's just a list of reminders for people that when they're faced with information, things that they can do. We know that in reality, people and ourselves, we don't go fact checking everything all the time. But there's a couple of reminders that we kind of put out, encouraging people to look out for things that appeal to their emotions, things that trigger them to perhaps share without thinking too much. And we have a video series on that. Show you a couple of examples of things we see in the European Parliament. So I mentioned that typically it's not the kind of high-tech deepfakes or anything like that that we're confronted with. It's more a case where perhaps a draft resolution, in this case one about COVID vaccines, that was never discussed in Parliament or never voted. It's just a draft that was supported by a handful of MEPs, becomes the basis of an information campaign that kind of claims the European Parliament says that. So to some extent, you need to be careful if you see news about the European Parliament. It's about trusted sources mostly, but if you see a statement that says the European Parliament says that, it's good to look out to see if that's really backed by a majority vote and it's not just one member of Parliament whose comments are being taken out of context. I'll show another one and then jump ahead a bit. Again, video, very easy to take out of context. In this case, our monitoring picked up a video which seemed to show a member of Parliament taking cocaine in the chamber. And we know that disinformation plays to people's biases and prejudices or negative feelings they might have. So for those who feel that, politics is very distant from them, this kind of video and the message that the member of Parliament, cares so little about what people think that he would take cocaine in Parliament. This spread quite quickly, and it was claimed to be the European Parliament. We noticed that it was in fact the German Parliament, and that the member in question was someone who was very keen on snuff tobacco, so it was nothing to do with cocaine. But this spread very quickly, and to show you how disinformation spreads, it was noticeable that a Russian government official on Twitter jumped on this and kind of spread it to kind of play into an existing narrative they have about Zelensky in Ukraine, claiming that he should be an MEP because they've been saying for a long time that Zelensky is a drug addict. So this kind of opportunity was something that they took up in an opportunistic way to spread. I'll mention another example briefly, and this is one where the European Parliament adopted a resolution saying Russia was a state sponsor of terrorism. We had a kind of strong reaction to that, and the following day we had a video appearing at first on Telegram and then spreading elsewhere, claiming that the paramilitary group Wagner had delivered a bloody sledgehammer to the European Parliament. So the video had been staged. The message was genuine, that it was a sort of threatening message to the European Parliament, but the video was staged, and we were faced with a dilemma in terms of how you respond to that. And obviously we didn't. It was designed to provoke and to change the message from the one that the European Parliament was trying to give. So we responded in a sort of more modest way, which was to respond to fact checkers and have a basic statement online. But the temptation, of course, with disinformation is to if something seems to be dishonest, there's a temptation sometimes to take it head on, to make it your headline. And if you lose your own framing, then obviously that's not very helpful to your discussion. I'll jump ahead a little bit just to elections. Around elections, we see that certain topics are targeted more than others. Conflicts, of course, equality issues, health issues, anything that's sensitive and divisive is something that's likely to be targeted during an election campaign. And there's a couple of specific ones that are challenged as well, with fake narratives, for example, the idea that there's disappearing ink on pens, or that there's perhaps false voting instructions spreading through, being mailed to people. So these are the kind of things that we see. I see I'm kind of used my time a little bit already, so I will jump ahead and just make one last point, which is really the best way to fight disinformation. I've mentioned, of course, the media, media literacy side, but the best way to fight disinformation is to get your proactive, positive communication right. Disinformation is a bit like the toothpaste that comes out of the tube. It's very hard to fight it or get it back in when it's out. So really the best way to combat it is to be clear in your own framing and your own messages. And we do our best to do that, for example, around elections. We've put out a lot of information and videos on that. So hopefully it will encourage people to vote, and hopefully the materials we've put out on media literacy will guide people as they prepare and decide who they want to vote for. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was incredibly interesting and a little bit alarming to see how sophisticated some of that stuff is, like the AI images. I wasn't surprised at all by the overconfidence of Irish people when it came to their ability to suss something out. But I was very wrong when it came to that AI face. I guessed that the woman was real, so it is eye-opening. So thank you so much for that, and it's really good to see the Parliament's perspective on it and the fantastic work that you're doing. And definitely those resources that you mentioned, maybe we'll follow up and make sure to the video series and stuff like that. Maybe we can get a link to that, and we'll include it in our follow-up if anybody would like to, anybody would like to look into that further. But thank you so much, Chris. I'm going to move on, just for timing purposes, we need to move on to our next speaker, who's Dr. Eileen Cullity. She's the Assistant Professor in the School of Communications and Deputy Director of DCU's Institute for Media, Democracy and Society. Eileen coordinates the Ireland hub of the European Digital Media Observatory and is co-chair of Media Literacy Ireland. And she's also a member of a working group developing a national counter-disinformation strategy. So Eileen, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your expertise with us today. So over to you when you're ready.
Thanks very much, Emma. So I hope you can see the slides and hear me all perfectly. And I won't go back over the roles I'm here. The main reason I'm here is because I'm the co-chair of Media Literacy Ireland, which is a national association that is trying to promote media literacy across Ireland. And I think if there's anything you take away from this, today would be that Media Literacy Ireland is the place you can go to, and I'll show you some of its resources later, but you can become a member of Media Literacy Ireland. There are lots of talks and resources and be part of this national effort to try and increase media literacy across the country. And it's by coincidence I come to this session from spending the morning talking to people who are experts in elections and protecting elections, and who are thinking about how to counter disinformation around elections. And these were experts from the US and from Europe. And one common theme that kept coming out was that it can't be people based in offices and state bodies. You have to go into communities and you have to work with community groups. And I think what the Wheel is doing here speaks to that exactly. So as part of what I'm going to cover today, I thought it might be important to set a few parameters for what we might achieve in the next 35 minutes or so. So I could offer you some broad insights on how to think about disinformation and how to think about building media literacy, and I can introduce you to some really good resources on that. But all of these things are helpful in a general sense. Each of you who represents a specific organization, you know your own area. You focus on a particular topic or a particular issue that could range from scouting to a health issue to homelessness. You have particular networks of supporters, you have funders, you have members that are critical to you, and you know your own networks. And you have a particular kind of organization that has its own objectives and that has its own resources, so that sets limitations on what you can achieve. And I'm saying all of this because the advice you get is pitched at the general level, and then you have to do the work as an organization or a representative of your organization to translate that into something that makes sense or is meaningful for your own organization. So what that means really is that I'm going to do lots of talking about that general level stuff, but you have to do lots of the thinking, and maybe not all of that thinking will be in this session today. Maybe here you'll get, the pointers, and you go away and do that thinking or talk to your colleagues about what does this mean for us and our organization. And the second caveat that I have is that, the reason you should be thinking about tackling disinformation is not just because these kind of charity and non-governmental organizations and voluntary organizations, it's not just because they're ideally placed to be media literacy ambassadors. That's true. It's also because your organizations are very likely to become targets of disinformation. So there's a twofold thing here. So you need to understand media literacy to go out and help others develop their media literacy, but you also need to understand how you might help yourself protect your own organization and the work that you do. And I'm going to concentrate maybe on that part first, because I think it's very important that all organizations develop that understanding now. As you may have noticed, in the past year or so, maybe more than the past year, there's been a lot of pushback against NGOs in particular, and this is just a narrative that has developed, and it's gaining a lot of traction online, and I think that's going to spread more to the charity sector as well, and looking at funding. And I think any organization needs to be ready to respond to that, and just to be clear about what it is and what it does. So these are the broad topics that I'm going to cover: how you understand disinformation, what do we know about how you go about countering disinformation, and what is the role of building media literacy in all of that. And then I'll finish up by pointing to some resources, including the Be Media Smart campaign. So when we think about countering or understanding disinformation, and Chris covered some of this already, but the first challenge is to develop a very clear definition of disinformation that distinguishes it from other kinds of problem content. And I think you can do this by asking two basic questions. One, is the information true or false? And two, is it intended to cause harm? And based on these two questions, we can make distinctions between different kinds of content. So for example, disinformation is false information that is intended to cause harm. Somebody is deliberately trying to confuse the public by sharing false information, false rumors, or they're manipulating content. Now, there might be lots of other types of false information, but if it isn't deliberately trying to cause harm or confuse people or deceive people, we don't call it disinformation. Instead, we call it misinformation. So for example, if you imagine a journalist who is reporting on a medical issue or an environmental issue, but that journalist has no scientific background and they're totally unfamiliar with scientific terminology. And then she publishes a report based on an interview with a scientist in which she misunderstood, some of the main points. And so the journalist ends up making incorrect statements about, I don't know, the causes of heart disease or whatever it is. And then the doctor she interviewed gets back to her and says, you got that wrong. If it's misinformation, the journalist would go, I did get that wrong. I will correct the record. I will, I make an adjustment and I'll make sure I don't make that mistake again. So you might consider that to be, an honest mistake versus somebody, let's say it's a climate denier who interviews a scientist and they deliberately misconstrue what the scientist said. They are deliberately presenting an inaccurate portrayal because they want people to be deceived. That's why we make this distinction between disinformation and misinformation. Another distinction we made, which is one that Chris touched on, is called malinformation. This might be true information, but it was never meant to be made public. So a very common example might be leaked phone messages or leaked emails or something like that, where the information, it's not that it's false, but it could be damaging to the reputation of your organization or to some, it could be, if it's a politician, it's damaging to the politician. The reason this is included in problem information is because it is designed to damage something, so it might be designed to cause harm. But if you think of, say, whistleblowers, they use leaks to contribute to public debate and to contribute to accountability. So these distinctions, academics love making distinctions between different things, but these distinctions are important. And I would encourage you to think of them, because one thing that has happened recently is that this word disinformation is just being tossed around to describe all kinds of things. And often it's used, especially by politicians, to describe any information they don't like. They just say, oh, well, that's disinformation. And we need to be careful about the words we use, and we need to help others understand these distinctions as well. And so the final category I have here is what you might just call negative information. So like bad customer feedback. Somebody just doesn't like the work that you do, or they don't like your organization. That's not disinformation. They're entitled to have their critical views. I mentioned earlier that there's been a lot of pushback against NGOs. You also get a lot of pushback against certain charities, I think, where people take the view that, that function shouldn't be left to charity, the state should be doing it. Now, you might disagree with that, but that view in itself, it's just a negative view of what you do. It's not disinformation, unless they go further and start making incorrect claims about your funding or about the work you do. It remains in the territory of negative information. And so I think what might be helpful for any organization is to then think about what might each of these categories look like for you. What are the types of things that are likely to generate disinformation? What are the types of things that are there risks associated with misinformation? Do you have quite a complex area that journalists don't really understand, or that members of the public don't really understand, so they're likely to be confused? Because that's a separate issue to there being people who are deliberately trying to promote disinformation about the area that you work in. And then similarly, are there risks to the way you manage information internally, so that there might be leaks that are damaging? And then are there just negative perceptions surrounding the kind of organization you are or the kind of work that you do? And that's a different issue, which I think you might want to still address, but you're addressing something different to disinformation. So if you were to think about, and if we were doing a longer workshop in person, you might go into groups and try and work some of this out here live. But this is something I think you could maybe go away and think about afterwards. So first think about what are the risks in each of these areas for you. And then you could think about, well, who are likely to be the sources of the disinformation? Who are likely to be sources of negative reviews or just holding negative or untrustworthy views of your organization, who might be likely to be misinformed. And that will be quite telling, because then you can start to think about, well, how influential are they likely to be? And the reason I say that is because there can be a temptation when you see negative information or false information to overreact. It's very important to think about, well, how influential is this in the grand scheme of things? And one of the reasons why it's important not to overreact is because you don't want to be wasting your time and resources responding to every false claim that you see online or every negative comment that you see online, when you could be putting your resources into something much more constructive and helpful for your organization and the communities that you serve. And also, if you think about it, for example, let's say there's somebody on a Facebook group or somebody on Twitter who's very angry. It seems like almost everybody on Twitter is very angry. But let's say somebody is very angry about the housing crisis and they're in a Facebook group or they're on their Twitter page, and they make a false statement about a housing charity or about the housing sector in general. It's important to put that false statement in perspective. Is that just some random person who's venting, which they are perfectly entitled to do? Maybe you don't like it that they're confused or they've gotten something wrong. Maybe they are deliberately spreading false information, and you don't like that either. But there is no laws against doing those things. The question to really ask is, how many people are likely to be influenced by that? If it's a very influential account, and the things they're saying are going to spread and lead to more people being having an incorrect view, then it's concerning. But if it's just somebody, venting, it's probably not that important, and it's probably not worth reacting to. In contrast, if there are journalists misreporting things, if there are politicians saying incorrect things, whether it's disinformation or misinformation, that's really important, because those figures are influential. They do have large constituencies who listen to them and look to them. So it's always important to try and hold these things in balance, to try and think about risks and how exposed you might be. And then when you've thought about those things, you could ask, well, could we preempt or pre-bunk? And I'll explain these two terms a little more later, but could you preempt what are likely to be false claims? If you work in a particular area and you know that journalists, members of the public, and politicians just have low levels of knowledge about your area and are therefore likely to be taken in by false claims, can you preempt them? Can you try and promote correct, accurate, clear, accessible information so that they are less likely to believe disinformation about your organization or your area of expertise when they see it? There's been a lot of interest in this recently. So things like, say, elections that are coming up. Most election bodies across Europe now are on high alert. They know the types of false claims that might emerge around elections, false claims about how you vote, false claims about the way votes are counted, false claims about whether postal votes are tampered with, and so on. And they're preempting it. They're trying to pre-bunk those claims by explaining to people, this is how voting works. This is why voting is secure. And as you can imagine, it is much more effective to preempt things and to forewarn people and forearm people than trying to correct something after a rumor has gone out and after a rumor has spread, because you can never reach everybody afterwards. So that's another thing that maybe you could take away and try to think about. And just on a final point on this part of protecting your organization, or thinking about the meaning of these things for your organization, and these questions that I posed here, maybe you found it very easy to answer these questions because you've already been thinking about this. Maybe you found it almost impossible to answer these questions because you've never thought about these things before at all, and you were left scratching your head about these new terms that you haven't heard before. And most likely, most of you fall somewhere between those two extremes. So wherever you are on the scale of, yep, I know the answers to those questions, or no, I have no idea how I'd even answer those questions, I think it would be very helpful to go away and talk to other people within your organization and try and come up with, answers yourselves so that your organization is clear about where you stand, and also to think about how you can stay informed. So maybe by the end of this session, you might want to join an organization like Media Literacy Ireland. There are loads of other resources I'll share where you can sign up for newsletters and or even follow something like the journal Fact Check, where you can be aware of what is going on in disinformation in Ireland. And I'll give you an example of, if any of you are there thinking, well, I didn't come here to find out about disinformation of my organization. And 2 years ago, I was listening to talks by librarians, public librarians in the US, and they were talking about the craziness that they were dealing with of activist groups coming into libraries, taking books off the shelves, threatening librarians. And I was watching that, and I was talking to Irish librarians, and it was as though, well, that's just something that's happening there in the US. And then in no time at all, that was happening in Ireland. People were in front of libraries, taking books out, filming themselves, and nobody saw that coming. Even those of us who look at online spaces a lot, we just did not see how quickly something developed in the US and then spread to Ireland. And that's why I'm stressing that I think no matter what kind of organization you are, I think you should take on board that you are very likely to become a target of disinformation campaigns, and you should be ready for that and think about what you can do there. So leaving that part aside, then I might just focus the rest of the time on, as an organization and as ambassadors that work in communities, if you are developing your understanding of disinformation and your understanding of media literacy, you are then better placed to communicate that through your networks. So I might just talk a little bit about disinformation itself, because it tends to be something that people have lots of preconceived ideas. So a question that people like me get asked all the time is, why do people believe in disinformation and why do they fall for it? And I just picked out last night some fact checks that the journal.ie has recently done. So you can see the kinds of topics that they have investigated recently. So claims about a government scheme, claims about the evidence for climate change, an AI-generated image being used to deceive people, and a hoax about the assassination attempt in Slovakia recently. So these are all just recent things that they have investigated. So you're quite diverse. So I want you to think for a moment about yourself, about people you know. Why might you fall for some of these pieces of disinformation? And are there any do you think maybe you yourself are susceptible? Do you think maybe people that you know of, or are there other people that you think are particularly susceptible? And again, if we were in person, I might ask you to elaborate a bit more on that, but I'll skip on to the next point, which is that we are all susceptible to disinformation. And many of us have a tendency, this is a noted human tendency, to assume that we ourselves are probably not susceptible to something, but other people are. So we are not susceptible to advertising, but other people are. So we worry about, oh, it's older people, or oh, it's younger people, or oh, it's less educated people. It's always somebody else, somebody not like us, but we're fine. And that phenomenon also applies to disinformation, where we tend to assume that, well, we're all right. I'm just worried about other people. They're the problem. In reality, the evidence suggests that the reasons people fall for disinformation are highly, highly contextual. What that means is that any of us in the right scenario could also be susceptible to disinformation. So the things I have highlighted here are just some of the major reasons or major factors that the research in this area points to. So the first is cognitive capacity, and that's not a very common phrase, but it's a much better phrase than education or intelligence, which I think is the thing people often refer to. And they just assume that it's something to do with intelligence. It isn't, because cognitive capacity is partially to do with your natural, maybe, ability to reason and think things out, but it's also to do with whether you have, the capacity in any given moment to pay attention and to understand something. And no matter how intelligent you are, or how well educated you are, if you are extremely stressed and extremely busy, and if you're worried about paying your mortgage, or you're worried about anything at all, you don't have the capacity to pay attention to things. If you're not interested in politics, you're not paying much attention. So cognitive capacity is not about intelligence. It's about whether you have the ability or resources in any given moment to pay attention to what you're seeing and reading. And if we're not paying full attention, then we're far more likely to believe the story about the assassination attempt in Slovakia, or that the climate change evidence isn't as good as it should be. So a related idea is situational attention. So if you are able to pay attention, and if you think about social media, and if any of you see people on TikTok, it's even more scary, where it's just constantly zooming on to the next thing. Social media is designed in a way to keep us in a constant state of unattention. So don't focus in on anything, scan a headline, move on to the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. That is primed to make us more likely to fall for hoaxes and disinformation. Motivated reasoning, a more common way of saying that might be bias. All of us, every single one of us, have topics and issues that we are heavily invested in and less objective about. Some people take that to more extremes, but all of us have it to some degree. We are we have to work really hard to take a step back and say, am I being objective here? Am I being fair here? And as you can probably gather now from what I've said, if you're really busy and you're stressed and you're on social media, the chances of you taking those steps back to ask those questions are greatly reduced. Other big factors are just prior knowledge. So if you have, as I said already, if you have limited knowledge about science in general, you are far more susceptible to disinformation about science. If somebody knows absolutely nothing about how the government works, they're far more susceptible to false claims that say, oh, the government is doing this, that, or the other. A very interesting one is repeated exposure. If you see something over or hear it over and over again, you are far more likely to think it's true. And then the last one is what I call the lack of literacies, which are issues around media literacy, which includes the digital literacy and everything else. But all of those factors come together. It's not a case of, person X is just, lacking in, is very biased, and they're not digitally literate, and that's why they believe disinformation. It's always very contextual. And so I think that's why all of us need to be much more humble and aware that we all have biases, we all have limitations. And when we're trying to talk to other people about media literacy or about disinformation, we need to be humble about it as well. It can't be this scolding conversation because I don't think anybody is going to be receptive to that. So if one question that's very common is, why do people believe disinformation? Another question that's very common is, why are people sharing it? And if they're sharing it, they must believe it. Just because people share something, it doesn't mean that they believe it or even endorse it. And there has been some research on this that looked like, why do people share during the pandemic? There was scare stories about vaccines, but also common with vaccines, you get scare stories about something terrible happening to children. We even see this now in Ireland, unfortunately, with rumors circulate that a migrant has attacked a child or something like that. When people share those types of stories, it doesn't necessarily mean they believe it, which is why news media often reports that story X or claim X was shared, 20,000 times. That doesn't mean 20,000 people believe it. They might share it, first of all, precisely because they are interested in concerned for other people. So if you hear something scary, like taking this vaccine could lead to something terrible happening to a child, or there's a dangerous, threatening person living in your community, it makes sense to share it. That the instinct to share it is a positive social instinct. You want to warn other people. You want to inform other people. And that's the real challenge for those of us who are trying to promote media literacy, to say, you need to step back. And if you really want to be positive in your community, you need to not share things unless you're sure that they're true. Because our instinct is to warn other people. And our instinct when we hear something scary or alarming is to share it. But two other reasons that people share false information is, one, they just want to express an opinion about it. They say, have you seen this? I think this is nonsense. Or they find it entertaining. This was evident a lot during the pandemic, when people shared conspiracy theory videos. It didn't mean that they believed them. They were sharing them because they found them absurd. So we just need to be quite careful and not jump to assumptions about why people are sharing things, and try and recognize if people are sharing things for positive reasons, for pro-social reasons, that is a good thing. And we can harness that instinct to be pro-social and try and encourage people to just be a bit more cautious about what they share. So in terms of understanding the role of social and digital media in all of this, I think that's the key task for media literacy. From the people I meet and speak to and dealing with students a lot, I think there's a broad understanding that digital media and social media are part of the problem, but people maybe don't necessarily understand why or what it is. We did some research in DCU on this before, and we asked in a survey, representative survey across Ireland, we asked people simple questions about social media, like how do social media companies decide what news to show you? Like a third of people thought that they hired journalists and the journalists picked the news you see, which is just so far removed from the reality. And I think that's where there's this enormous gap. People broadly know, oh, there's something about social media that's a big role in this, but they don't really understand a lot about it. And so from a media literacy point of view, I think one of the most important things that anyone can know about a social media platform is that they make their money by keeping us, the users, on those platforms for as long as possible. That's how they collect data. That's how they sell it to advertisers. And that is just the number one thing people should know and understand about social media. And because their goal is to keep us on their platforms for as long as possible, those platforms are designed in particular ways to encourage us to stay there. And it is the design of the platforms that encourages disinformation content or sensational content or just very angry and aggressive content. So for example, if you ever find yourself scrolling mindlessly through whatever your social media platform of choice is, that is the result of a design decision, okay, that has been tested, that you are likely to stay there. And even though you wanted to go off and make dinner or go for a walk or read a book or do something more constructive, you end up spending half an hour just scrolling through social media in case something more interesting comes along. That is a design decision. Similarly, things like the little ... to tell you that somebody is typing, that is designed to keep you there. So I don't know, maybe some of you have much better willpower than me, but I often find myself saying, okay, I'm done with this now. I'm going to, turn off my phone and go to bed. But I see the ... and go, oh, I better wait because someone is trying to send me a message. So I'll wait to see what they say. And you end up spending another half an hour having a fairly inane conversation when you had planned on logging off and going somewhere else. Again, that is the result of design. Possibly the most famous thing are the likes, the retweets, the reshares, because they give us a sense of validation. So we go and seek them out. And that encourages particular kinds of content. And what's also very striking is that leaks, and remember I mentioned earlier that leaks can sometimes be good because that is people revealing true information in the public interest. Leaks from these platforms tell us that they knew this. They knew that the way they designed their algorithms, that the way they designed the platforms were having destructive consequences for society. And they knew it and haven't really done anything about it. So in a way, that's the key media literacy message about social media platforms. I think more generally, we can also think about just what has happened in society as we shifted from a mass media world to a digital media world. And this is where your age might be a factor. So I teach lots of students who are under 20, and they never knew a mass media world. They only know a digital media world, a world where everyone is on their own devices, plugged into their own little sphere of influence. Whereas those of us who grew up in a mass media world were used to, not that that world was perfect, we shouldn't be trying to go back there or anything, but it was a world where there were less media producers, so there were common reference points, and more of us had to share those common reference points, whether we agreed with them or not. But now you could be sitting next to people who just, the content they consume is so far removed from what you're seeing that you don't really have those common reference points. I don't blame that all entirely on social media platforms, but I think as a society, we're still struggling to deal with some of those shifts. So the debunking handbook, I meant to put up a full link to it, but I'll send it on afterwards. the Debunking Handbook is a book written by some brilliant psychologists who have done lots of research over decades on how do you correct false claims. And the number one piece of advice that comes out of it is that you always affirm or reinforce correct information in a clear, accessible way. And this comes back to what I was saying earlier about not getting stuck in the weeds of responding to every piece of disinformation and refuting all of these false claims that you see, but making sure that the people that matter to you, your constituency, that they know what the correct information is. So for example, if it's the Electoral Commission and we're coming up to an election, they put out correct information. They keep reinforcing this is how you vote, this is how the electoral process works, not getting dragged into conspiracy theories and everything else. So if any of you are interested in learning how to respond to disinformation, I think the Debunking Handbook is a really good resource. And then pre-bunking, which is a term I mentioned earlier, this is about providing a counter argument to false claims so that you're already helping people anticipate the kinds of false claims that they might see. So in that voting example, you might tell people, if you wanted to pre-bunk, you might say, you're very likely in the coming weeks to see claims online that the Irish about, write your name on the ballot, or that you can't trust the votes because there's no electoral commission or whatever it is. You tell people in advance, you're going to see these false claims. They're not true. If you want true information about the Irish election, you go to the Electoral Commission website. And by telling people in advance, when they do come across those false claims, it's already in their head, people might be trying to deceive me here. I know where to go to get correct information. And that's probably the most effective thing any of us can do, is just reaffirm correct information and point people to official sources, which is not telling people what to think. It's not telling people that they're wrong. It's telling people, well, this is the official source of information for that topic, or this is the consensus on that topic. And then, so just a little bit on media literacy, or finish up in a few minutes. I think there's a misconception about media literacy, which is that media literacy is something you either have or you don't have. And again, that there's these people out there who are just lacking in media literacy, and if we make them all more media literate, all of these problems will go away. That's the incorrect way to view it. So you could ask yourself the question, how media literate are you? How media literate are your friends or your parents? And you might find that same phenomenon where you think, well, I'm fairly media literate, but I'm not sure if my friends are. I think they need to improve their media literacy. All of us can improve our media literacy, because media literacy is a very diverse and complex topic. So I, for example, I'm a lecturer in media study. I teach media studies. I research media studies, or I research media. I'm the co-chair of Media Literacy Ireland. I would consider myself to have high levels of media literacy in some areas. And then there are other topics, other aspects of the media and of the digital world that actually my knowledge is pretty weak in, and that I would like to improve over time. And that's true of all of us. We might be knowledgeable in some areas and not in others. And I'm really stressing this because there's a perception out there in particular that young people are really digitally savvy, so they're fine, and that older people are really lacking in digital literacy, so they're the problem. And I think this is a very destructive message, because the reality is older people who grew up in that mass media world are actually very media literate in some areas, in particular about what journalism is, about how you source and why you might trust one source over another, but they're not maybe as knowledgeable about how digital media works, for sure. But younger people, in contrast, are very confident in their levels of literacy. They know how to use lots of digital platforms. Their level of understanding about how media works, though, is quite weak. So I think it's much more helpful if we all understand ourselves as being knowledgeable in some areas, weaker in other areas, and our goal might be to improve across the board. And you'll never get to a point where you say, I'm media literate now. It doesn't matter, because the media environment is always changing. So it's always a case that we need to be improving our media literacy and holding it as something that we need to be aware of. So finally, coming to the end, Media Literacy Ireland as the national association, it's facilitated by the media regulator, Comisiún na Man. It has a large number of individuals and organizations that represent lots of different sectors, and they come together to promote media literacy, and that's done through things like training events. It's also done through a national campaign, the Be Media Smart campaign. We host webinars, and also through awards. So we try and encourage organizations, but also schools to do work on media literacy, and then to apply for our awards, so we can recognize people in different areas who are doing work on media literacy. So perhaps the most high profile thing we do is the Be Media Smart campaign. So that's the part that's flickering on your screen there. So this is an initiative which encourages people to just stop, think, and check that the information they see, read, or hear is reliable and accurate. And if you think back to what I was saying about the media, that it's everything about social media in particular encourages us to just not be paying attention and to just keep scrolling or to keep hitting like. The message to people, the most basic message, is to just stop for a moment and go, is this really credible? Should I be sharing this? Should I be engaging with it? So you can go to the Be Media Smart website, where you'll find a lot of information here. So the campaign runs annually, but the information is still valid. There's lots of tips on how to be more media literate. There's an Ask the Expert section where you can read things like, what are algorithms? How does disinformation spread? So you can build up your knowledge there. There's a lot of fact checks that are available as well. So I'd really encourage you to go to this website and explore it and see what you might take from it. Then at the moment, in the context of elections, so Media Literacy Ireland and EGMO Ireland are part of an EU-wide campaign to encourage people to be election smart. And it's just sharing these simple messages, you know, like to read more than the headline, to look for more than one source, and so on. And these are just, they're tips. And remember, I was saying tips are very high level, very general, but it is good to put those out there. So any of you can follow along with this campaign and use some of the materials from it if you want to share those with your networks as well. And one final thing I wanted to highlight is by one of our partners that we work with a lot, and a member of Media Literacy Ireland, the Journal. They've recently launched this very interesting knowledge bank, and it's at factchecking.ie, where they provide explanations for, you know, things around elections. So I highlighted some of the elections examples here, like what is an MEP and what do they do? And then these sections, how do you read around elections? Provide some insights into what are the issues and how elections are covered. What are the issues? What are the things people are often confused about? What are the things that people often spread disinformation around? So if you're particularly interested in doing something around elections, I would think this is a great place to go first and to build up your knowledge. Because remember, media literacy is just one thing, it's understanding how media works. But whatever the topic is, whether it's elections, whether it's housing, whether it's health, whether it's climate change, if people don't have knowledge about that topic, they're more likely to believe disinformation or to spread misinformation. So we need to also increase knowledge about particular topics as well. So those are all the things that I wanted to cover. And coming back to Media Literacy Ireland, if any of you or you as an individual or your organization would like to join Media Literacy Ireland, I know many of you are members already, you could just go to the website and you fill in a little form, and you can then become a member and access a lot of the resources that we have. So thank you very much, and be interested in any questions you might have later.
Thank you so much, Eileen. That was incredibly interesting, and I can see there's lots of questions already coming in. Just a reminder, if anybody does want to ask any questions, please put them in the Q&A now, because we will have kind of a limited time at the end. But just really, really useful information there, and very important that all of us as organisations working with communities need to get on top of this and need to be aware of it, because it's only going to become a bigger and bigger problem as time goes on. You know, this level of disinformation that we're dealing with. So thank you so much, Eileen. That is brilliant. Great. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Sarah Singleton, who leads social inclusion research bit of a tongue twister, at Task. So Sarah's going to talk to us a little bit about one of their projects that they did around media literacy. So it's just food for thought. If this is interesting, if you're working with a specific group that you feel are very, could really do with more capacity building around media literacy, maybe you're interested in doing your own project on the topic, or you want to tap into the work that Task has done. It was a good idea anyway to kind of offer a case study as a reference point for that. So Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. So over to you, and then we will have some time for questions after.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for joining us today, and thanks to Eileen and Chris for their presentation so far. I'll keep this quite brief and just give you an overview of a project I worked on last year. So this was a project called Media Literacy for Democracy, and it was a project that we were part of in Task as part of a European consortium. So it was a group of organizations across 5 different countries: Italy, Ireland, Spain, Bulgaria, and Poland. And they worked together kind of as part of also a multi-sector project, because there was think tanks, kind of civil society, and the university sectors as well across those countries. So, and that project was funded by the SERVE program from the European Commission, which is a large and varied pot of funding that stands for Citizenship, Equality, Rights and Values program. So they often have funding towards programs that particularly touch on media literacy and disinformation as kind of a function of democracy. So the aims of that program were to kind of to really research and tackle disinformation as it is across different countries, and also to give that kind of multi-country kind of comparison and contrast of what are the kind of common shared challenges, and also what are the differences between countries. And you had kind of countries with kind of different systems and different kind of ways of consuming media, and different rates of disinformation. Chris kind of outlined some of the ways that Ireland is different or unique in kind of our levels of kind of confidence, even with how much we'd recognize this information. A big part of the project as well was kind of looking at media literacy as that part of kind of informed citizenship and democracy. So if people kind of know what they're voting for and have kind of correct information, and how important that is for democracy. So I kind of will go on now to next slide. But this is the kind of first phase. So the project had three phases. The first one was a launch event and development through research of kind of a toolkit for civil society and individuals to kind of recognize and respond to fake news. So in that launch event, there's about 120 people from across the 6 countries. We had kind of a number of kind of experts in a panel, not kind of dissimilar from this conference. And we launched this toolkit. So you see kind of one of these diagrams from the toolkit here, like how would you kind of counter and spot fake news, and steps you could take, and how civil society or as an individual you would approach that. So you can find the booklet here through this link, but I'll also send it on at the end of this. So it's kind of sharing kind of research from different countries, what's out there, kind of amalgamating it into this booklet that can kind of give practical steps to people and recognizing fake news, or is integrating it into an organization that works, that might touch on the area. The second phase, which was probably the longest, is that we had citizen workshops. So the kind of end goal of this was to come up with a strategy document to present, and recommendations to present to the EU Commission about what to do with at different kind of levels, kind of the EU level, like a national level. Also focusing on education at different stages, on the media, and then on international kind of digital media corporations as well. What kind of different approaches could be taken. So there was a series of workshops in each of the countries involved. The particular focus of the workshops was on people kind of 18 to 35 years old. And as Elaine just mentioned at the end, there is kind of this idea that younger people are, more comfortable with media, or have been using social media their whole lives, so maybe more digitally literate. That's found not to be the case necessarily. It's for me a particularly kind of challenging setting to get information and receive kind of correct information and recognize fake news. So the decision was taken to kind of make that particular age group a focus. They're also an age group that haven't been consulted majorly kind of on this area yet. So those workshops were run with that age group as well. And they really focused on misinformation, polarization, and also the disengagement in politics among that age group across the different countries. So we had in Ireland, we had 3 days of workshops, and one focused on kind of how you might embed media literacy in the education system across like primary, secondary school and tertiary education. Then we had a workshop on misinformation and disinformation and the rise of the far right in Ireland, which already seems like a very kind of different, more intense issue now than it did about 9 months ago. And finally, one of the sessions kind of focused on balancing media literacy with kind of free speech discourse as well. So there is kind of in the literature a lot of kind of concern about how you would effectively have media literacy strategies while remaining kind of neutral or preserving free speech, and concerns that power structures will contribute to what is considered fake news or not. And all those workshops were kind of led by a younger citizen who did research in that area and had a focus in kind of breaking into small group work to discuss what might be feasible and practical in a strategy and recommendations document. And so finally, the last stage was to kind of have to produce this report with recommendations and present it to the EU Commission. There was also a final event this March. So those recommendations were for policymakers, journalists, media workers, civil society, the education sector. Again, looked at policy recommendations at different levels, what could be done from an EU level, from a national level, and in different sectors, education, traditional media, digital media as well. I can also share with you that policy document. And the kind of areas broadly that it covered in terms of recommendations were the promotion of media literacy as a part of tackling this information, what could be done in schools, and also a review of within that document of what is being done in schools across the different countries at the moment, focusing well on the need for like further research as things develop really rapidly, and also kind of having to have a focus on different sectors. Like it can't just be media or education. You have to kind of look at it cross-sectorally at all times. There is a really strong focus on the EU, and if anyone here is interested in pursuing kind of funding for projects or for research, there's a greater focus on like recent kind of iterations of the SERVE program for projects that look particularly at socially excluded groups and media literacy who might not kind of access to existing initiatives as well. I think some of those interesting things that came out of it, I think were touched on maybe by Elaine a bit as well, that it's not for younger people, for that cohort, it wasn't even necessarily the false information or misinformation, disinformation. It was the kind of the format young people were like getting information in. So it was kind of that really small chunks of information, also the kind of algorithmic way of getting information where you'll get, if you like something, the kind of algorithm will show you more of the same thing. So you get the kind of idea of this is kind of consensus opinion, even if what it starts out with is quite innocuous. It's just a kind of pattern of that way of getting information, and really kind of trying to think of how best to handle that, to deal with that across from education into regulation as well. So I can share that document with you also at the end of this. But thank you. That's just a very quick overview of that research project.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. That's really interesting, and definitely please do share all of your resources. And I saw Eileen shared some in the chat as well. All of this, everything that's kind of mentioned, will be included in the follow-up email along with all the slides and things like that. So I think it's a really useful example of a civil society group themselves kind of tackling this issue, and definitely some interesting findings from it. Okay, well, I'm going to ask our three speakers to come back. So Chris as well, if you could join us if you're there, because I've just got a few questions from our audience here, so we'll try and go through them before the end of our session. So a few questions that come in. One practical one, I suppose, somebody asked, should you block people who are making hateful comments on Facebook, or does that make it worse because it looks like you're silencing people? So it's kind of that question around interacting. Is it just fueling, or what's? Anybody can jump in, by the way, so please, if you have a thought, please do.
Well, I think if someone's being hateful, yeah, just block them. I mean,
Yeah, okay.
you're not obligated to. If it was in the street and someone came up ranting at you and screaming in hateful ways, you would walk away from them.
Yeah.
So I think we have to reclaim some of civic space and say these are standards we expect of engagement, and being hateful is part of it.
Great. Okay, Chris, did you want to?
Sure. We've had this dilemma a lot for our own accounts on social media. And obviously, being the European Parliament, you need a big range of opinions, and any kind of attempt to moderate at all is always going to be, you're always going to be accused of censorship. But the policy we have is that we do have quite a clear policy that's there. So obviously hateful speech is forbidden, but also even commenting off topic and things like that. The reason we need to have that is that you do get a lot of active campaigns that sort of target our accounts, and maybe you see that on your own pages as well. But for example, to give one sort of quite suspicious example, we had our Bulgarian language Instagram account was targeted on Women's Day with about 1,000, 2,000 comments from Russian-based accounts just saying Happy Women's Day. Except a lot of these accounts had the Z, the kind of pro-war Z logo in their profile. So, you could argue the content itself is just saying Happy Women's Day, but this is why we say it's important to look at behavior as well as content. So anything that's distorting the debate, and Eileen gave an example, someone that comes up to you in the street, same thing, you set the rules for your own spaces. If someone was shouting or taking all the speaking time, that wouldn't be right either. So I think it helps to have a clear moderation policy up front, so that then if you do take action, and depending on the platform, sometimes you're hiding comments rather than fully deleting or blocking them. So the person who's posted them maybe still sees their own comment. I think all those are valid if you've published in advance your policy, and if people complain, you kind of refer to your policy. Those are the rules of engagement for your own accounts, really.
Okay, great. That's really useful, actually. The idea of having a moderation policy. I think our comms team have that, but certainly, I don't know whether every organization in Ireland would have something like that, but it's going to become more and more important to have that. Another question came up around, why has there been a language change? I mean, from something being a lie to something being disinformation. Again, does anybody want to jump in on that? It's more of a philosophical question.
Yeah, that's a really good question in a way. And I think there are terms like propaganda, lies that we previously all understood. In part, it's to do with that reason I was saying that there is these distinctions made between disinformation and misinformation. It's to make those distinctions between honest mistakes and things that are deliberate. Unfortunately, now that's the term that we're stuck with and that everyone uses. But if you're talking to people, if they understand the concept of a lie better, I wouldn't get bogged down in the terminology.
Yeah. Okay, great. Brilliant. I have one. Oh, sorry, Chris, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just very briefly. I think in the policy circles, they're even moving a little bit more now to talking about information manipulation. It's a little bit clearer that you're talking then about the behaviors, again, not just the content. So something's been manipulated. So people might have a different idea about what a lie is. Everyone has their own vision of the truth, but manipulation where you can point to something actually being faked or altered in some way, or this kind of coordinated behavior, I think that's a little bit easier to get around the same idea, even if you have different sort of political or factual views on things.
Yeah, I suppose it's also it's about trying to be careful about accusations you're making, because some people might well skew information, but it's because of their own bias and they don't really realize that they're doing it. They're just seeing what they want to see, I suppose. So maybe it's not intentional, but it's still disinformation in a way. So it's still, it's probably there's a bit of a gray area in all of these things. Great. Okay, so here's another question came in from Harriet. What do you think we can learn from young people when it comes to media literacy and how they interact with the online world? So I know, Sarah, that kind of links in with your project a little bit. Do you want to share any of your learnings?
I think there is definitely like a kind of a very kind of a good kind of baseline of interrogating information that you're sent from people and what you see as being false or not amongst young people that were kind of at our workshops, and from kind of literature as well, that they have kind of a good they're kind of being able to recognize something that is fake news. And I think that is maybe something from just maybe having it around all of our kind of lives, I think. And I think the kind of thoughts around seeing something, recognizing it, and then really like not sharing something. And I think that's okay with the workshop. You know, you obviously don't have necessary time to really be checking everything that you read. It's just not feasible. Like there's all these kind of things that are recommended that we should be doing, but we really in reality won't have time. But the one thing is, if you're going to share and spread something, to kind of take responsibility to have a kind of very quick kind of look and see if it is really easy kind of false information or not.
That's perfect, Sarah. Is there anything anybody else wants to add, or we can move on to the next one? Okay, great. So lots of a nice comment about from somebody about the webinar, which is great. I'm glad it's been useful. I would like to ask whether you can advise on how to tackle misinformation within our organizations themselves. I find creating an external communication strategy that tackles disinformation to be easier a part of this issue, whereas tackling dis or misinformation internally can be trickier, and it can lead to a tense environment where the pre/debunking, or can the pre/debunking handbook help with this? So that's an interesting question. Does anybody want to jump in on that one?
Well, I'll just jump in because you mentioned the debunking handbook. But I think this goes back to the point I was making about every organization is very different in particular. So you need to start to think about how you can apply those insights yourself. I mean, if it's a case of false claims about organizational practice, well, then you can define and set what you're saying the correct information is. If it's straying into that territory of people who have freedom within the organization to have their own views on how things should be done, you know, that's the line that you have to decide where that's drawn, and that's going to be just very particular depending on the type of organization you're in. But one thing that the pre-bunking and the debunking about is just defining things, being clear. This is the authoritative information. For example, in the area of health, this comes up a lot, not all over the world, where health workers are told, if you're asked about vaccines, about members of the public, these are the things you are permitted to talk about. If somebody asks you, what are your personal views on vaccines, you do not engage in that. And that was to get around the way that individual health workers are entitled to their personal views. But the health authorities are saying you shouldn't be engaging the public with that while you're representing our organization.
Yeah, it's a really, that's an excellent point, that you can't control everybody's opinion of things, but you can certainly counter it with as much factual information as possible. Does anyone want to add anything to that, or is that okay? So I'm conscious we go on to the next one because we do have quite a few, and it'd be nice to get through them before we finish up. So Frida Donoghue asks, I think the Irish Times reported that over 50% of anti-immigration hashtags like hashtag Ireland is full in December 2023 had originated in the UK and the US. How can we bring awareness to this kind of deliberate interference that aims to stoke tensions? Good question. Nathan, I'd imagine that's come up in the Parliament before. Chris, I don't know if you have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, definitely. I think a few years ago, there used to be a clearer distinction between foreign interference and sort of domestic disinformation, if you can call it that. And now it's much more of a mix. You'll see, I think I showed an example where a Russian government official had jumped on a sort of bandwagon of something that was going around. So it used to be that, you know, all the focus was on troll farms and the things they were generating. It's a lot more mixed now. But it is helpful to highlight foreign interference. The EU External Action Service has a website called EU versus Disinfo, which acts a bit like a fact checker and works a lot on really exposing the techniques. I think that's becoming more and more common. Show how they work, and so that people can see for themselves. That's part of media literacy. When they recognize the tactics being used, they'll be a lot more aware. So I think certainly the sort of findings from the media that I mentioned there, the origin of where these accounts come from, but just the more awareness people have on the techniques and tactics that are being used, I think the more they'll spot it themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's badly needed in terms of education, really, in the country overall. Eileen, if you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I might just add there that, as Chris said, it's the tactic that's important. And I would say that the tactic there, or the issue there, is that there are certain issues now that take on this global dimension. And so Ireland has become a focal point for extremists and activists in the US and elsewhere. And that's why you see a lot of this activity. But on that specific report, it was a Sky News report originally that the Irish Times was reporting on. To identifying whether the accounts came from outside of Ireland or not can be a little tricky. It's not an exact science, so some people would debate those figures. And I think we have to be very resistant from the narrative that maybe some people want, which is, oh, this is all being stoked up from outside. It is very, very clear that there are plenty of people in Ireland who are happy to indulge in these narratives, and the people who are burning down buildings and threatening politicians and workers, they're not coming from outside. So we have to just, be clear about the challenges are not just something being done to us. We're doing a lot of this ourselves.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Thank you, Eileen. Great. Okay, and then Maria just has a kind of a comment, I suppose, that it's always the way, especially in the hard right kind of space, that the information that they use like a kind of kernel of truth to legitimize what they are saying, even though the majority of what they are spreading is disinformation and fear. So it's kind of more of a comment than a question. I might, like Sarah, I suppose, is that something that, did that come up in your project? I assume it did.
Yeah, so one thing I was thinking, it's even maybe relevant a bit for the last question, like on things particularly like migration. One of the suggestions that came up is like there should be some kind of easy to access data. And for example, in Ireland, like there would be CSO data if you can really like access it easily. And you see like some kind of fact checking articles in different newspapers as well, particularly around migration, about the numbers. I think a lot of arguments end up, instead of arguing about strategies or what we should do to manage migration, you're arguing about numbers and what the facts are. So just to kind of, you can reference kind of those articles and look at sources for them. And people are more accepting that they kind of, both, any kind of side can kind of look at that as a source. So they can be quite useful in those cases.
Okay. There's one more question that I'll just kind of pose to everybody, because I think you all have maybe something that you can contribute. It just came in the chat. Does the panel have any suggestions about how we can help educate people close to us, such as family and friends, where more diplomacy maybe needed, a bit more sensitivity? So, because it can be a really hard conversation, people can get quite defensive and feel like, you're kind of calling them stupid if they don't necessarily ask these questions. So I'll kind of give a final word to everybody. Chris, do you want to go, and then I'll go around in a circle on my screen?
Sure, it's a difficult one, especially when sometimes the views are so extreme. And I've seen even things like how to talk to a conspiracy theorist, and the reality is there's some people you just won't reach. Part of what we say is, of course, find common ground. And very often when confronted with these sort of very improbable beliefs and scenarios, it's often good to ask questions rather than just give, of course not insults are not helpful, and that happens a lot on social media, but even sort of not just give opposing statements, but sometimes ask questions. And often that's been a good way to sort of speak to conspiracy theorists. Instead of like give something completely opposite, make them ask those questions to themselves, to think a little bit about their own reasoning. But it's extremely difficult, of course.
Yeah, it is. Thank you, Chris. Eileen, you're next on my screen.
Yeah, I think exactly as Chris said, kind of gently encouraging people to ask questions, but also it's very important to understand, let's say, conspiracy theorists. Let's say somebody has conspiracy theory about the New World Order or whatever it is, and not to talk down to them, and also to realize that that person spends a lot of time reading about that topic, and they're actually far more knowledgeable probably than you are about that topic. So before you try and raise it and say, you're all wrong about immigration, you need to have the facts established. So I think the first thing to do is to read about the topic and understand it really well yourself. Because if you challenge somebody or try to raise questions and then they confront you with information and you don't even know it yourself, it's going to totally defeat the point.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Another great piece of advice. And Sarah, any thoughts from your experience?
Yeah, I think something particular what Chris said is it's really important to try to not be immediately dismissive of people. Like when we're talking about people, in our lives, personal lives, that we have to kind of deal with maybe in our families and and things like that. And also, yeah, just asking kind of questions to get them to kind of explain themselves a bit and talk about it, and just kind of be interested in maybe the why they feel like that, without having to agree with them. And what I said for the last point as well, like if, yeah, like Eileen says, like you can find information, some of the facts about things like if it was about migration, about the numbers of people here and the patterns over time, that you can kind of engage with people on that level if you kind of are kind of confident on that.
Yeah, it's brilliant points. I think it's I suppose about empathy really, is trying to and being prepared and having the information. And I think as a kind of organizations working with communities, it's our kind of job to kind of counter some of that information, that overwhelmingly negative stories, particularly when you talk about things like migration and stuff like that, with other narratives that are a little bit more positive and hopefully more truthful and factual. So that's really it. Thank you so much. I have to thank our three panelists, Chris Coakley from the European Parliament, Dr. Eileen Cullity from UCD and Media Literacy Ireland, and Dr. Sarah Singleton from TASC. Thank you very much for sharing your incredible expertise. It was such an interesting session. I really learned loads, and from all the comments, everybody's been really, really happy with it and has taken a lot away from it. So thank you for that, and thank you everybody for participating and sharing your questions and your feedback. We will, as I said, all of those links that were shared in the chat, everything else that was mentioned, we'll compile everything into an email along with the slides, and we'll follow up with everybody, so you'll get all of the information and the recording, because I think there's definitely stuff that people will want to revisit there. And just also a big thank you, we're just 1 minute over, so just a big thank you to the European Parliament Liaison Office, who supported us to run this webinar today, and who's been supporting us to do a range of activities coming up to the election to encourage people to engage in a way that is informed, to reach out to their communities and engage them, and trying to enable with them or give them the capacity to do that confidently, which is, I suppose, is one of the goals of this session. And don't forget to vote. Use your vote on the 7th of June. So thank you so much, everybody. It was a great session, and we'll be in touch soon with the follow-up. Thanks all.
Bye-bye.